Hi, this is Doug from Wargaming Your Underwear and Area 21. And this is a very quick video for those of you who are trying to figure out this whole logistic bullshit in Thunder in the East. This is not a complicated system. It really isn't. But like most games that have some sort of new paradigm, new mechanism in place to kind of show some element of warfare, um, this one seems to be tripping people up a little bit, and I thought I would just give a really quick overview so that you can kind of see what goes on with this. It's really not all that difficult. We're going to take a fairly small part of the map. This is the Barbarossa scenario. This is the historical setup. I did make a small change. You'll see why in just a minute. But otherwise, this is actually something you do at the very start of the Barbarossa campaign, and you would do this. I mean, with the historical setup, it's a little less important. Everything's kind of a known thing, and I actually went with a really historical setup. I mean, it was specific units and specific hexes. This is going to be, and this is that setup, although I'm doing things a little bit differently. Okay, so the logistics part of this game has two factors to it, two elements. The first element is called being in communication. This is the thing that's going to actually trace what most of you are probably used to as thinking of as a supply line or a supply trace. We are not doing that. We are seeing whether or not this particular unit, marker, hex, whatever, is actually able to communicate. And by communicate, I don't just mean pick up the phone and talk. I mean get stuff back and forth, do what it needs to do to be it. Your infrastructure's in place, all of that sort of stuff. That is how you are able to. That's called lines of communication, and that's the thing you do first. All right, we are not going to supply things yet. We're going to see whether or not they're in communication, and maybe the best way to think about this is being in communication allows you to throw supply. We want to find out if things are in communication so that they can either throw or be thrown supply. Okay? Really not all that complicated. First thing we do is we're going to figure out the lines of communication. For our purposes, we're going to worry about three things. We're going to worry about headquarters, this big round guy right there, sticking up Soviet West Front. That is something we need to see whether he's got a line of communication. Let's hide the troops real quick. And you can also see here you've got the city of Minsk, and it's got a big number there, right? Oh, see, and that's already showing we've got units, but and there's a 6. That means it is a supply city. Riga is a supply city and a major port. And you can tell that because it's got green on one side and blue on the other side, whereas Minsk is just all green. So this actually is a supply city. It also is a major port. Pamu, Tallinn, Narva, those are not major ports. They're not supply cities. They have zeros. So anything that's got a 6 in it, like this, is a supply city, and it needs to be in communication. So you go back to an ultimate supply source. Today we're going to pretend that's the friendly edge of the board, and it has to go via what we call a rail line of communication, or an RLoC. You also can do this via naval lines of communication. Ignore that for now. Maybe that might be important on the Black Sea or something later, maybe with the Kurland Gap, who knows. For right now, it is not important. Just worry about, let's make sure we can get a rail line of communication, RLoC. We don't care about naval lines of communication, NLoCs. We do care about overland lines of communication, which are OLoCs. We're going to start with the RLoCs. All right, we have these lovely little dice, the yellow dice that you've all seen and wonder what the heck this is for. This is when you want to use it. All right, your dice is going to come and sit, on that city, because we know that it is able to trace a line of supply via rail lines all the way to the edge of the map. We aren't quite there, but trust me, it's the beginning of the game. Nobody's back there. All right, what else? we've got this, but it also has the headquarters, okay? And the headquarters, either one of those can throw out a supply line of 6 hexes. So we've cleverly placed this handy little marker back here just so we'd remember to do that. All right, let's do one more just for fun. And what's that one going to be? There aren't a lot of supply sources out here. Basically, Brovary, that's going to be one. And we can also see that Lvov is going to be one. And because now there's also, just so we know right ahead of time, there's also headquarters in Lvov, but it's exactly the same range. It's got a range of 6. There are some things that change if you've got an HQ that's in attack mode, and if it's a strategic HQ instead of operational, then it can throw supply farther, but we're not worrying about that. We are worrying solely about whether or not these things are in lines of communication. And we've got 4 of them. That's good enough for now. We'll go with that, and this will give you a good sense, especially at this turn of the game. Next, we figure out whether the units have a line of communication. That means that they have to have a line that doesn't enter prohibited hexes, it doesn't cross lakes, any of the normal craziness, but it also can't go through a zone of control, mostly. So this unit, for example, this guy right here, he's a mechanized unit, but he can trace here, 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 and get back to there. Doesn't matter what the distance is. We're not throwing supply. We're just seeing if they're in communication. This guy, normally that guy's throwing a Zoc, he's throwing a Zoc. If this was not a passable hex, let's say that this hex here was a lake, he could still go out because this guy here is obstructing the line of communication, or obstructing that EZOC coming from this unit, because this is a line of communication check. And this is the only time when friendly units negate EZOCs. Okay? Maybe major unit versus a minor unit. Don't worry about it. All our units right now that we care about are major units. They're all medium or large units. They're all major. Okay? So he would be able to still trace out through there. We look at our other units that are around here. They all can trace. Wait a minute. Hey, here's a guy. Right there. Let's zoom in on this a bit. Okay? Here's this dude. The 10th Infantry Army dude. There he is, sitting there. Hey, he throws a Zoc here, and he throws a Zoc here. You are isolated right off the top. Okay? Once you know he's isolated, you don't care about if he's in supply. You're only throwing supply to the units that aren't isolated. So you've already established there's a line of communication. Okay? That's it for our lines of communication. Remember, now, units always use overland. All right? But if they're in a supply city that is in supply, clearly they're going to be fine. Or if they've got, maybe they're in the Kurland Gap or Kurland pocket up here, which is where the Germans ended up late 44, 45, they were sort of stuck here. They eventually got a breakout, but it was not pretty. But they have a port here, which would allow them to probably get some sort of naval supply. I'm not going to cover that, but just be aware that their naval supply is probably in this particular title most important when it comes to finding people who are isolated behind lines on a coast. All right. I want to cover one other thing really quickly here. Let's say, and these are the 2 units I swapped around before. All right. In this case, he clearly is not isolated. Okay? Because he can trace through here, get back to a supply city or HQ, no problem. This unit, however, has the same problem. Zoc, Zoc. So what's he going to do? Well, hey, wait a minute. He is motorized. He's got that lovely little white movement factor of 5. If you are motorized, you don't need to worry about EZOCs that are thrown out by leg units which have these not as lovely black numbers. So he could actually trace an overlying route of communication back to here, anywhere really, because he doesn't care about these guys. They're all leg units. If this guy and this guy had been mech, it would have been different. Or if they'd even been mounted, like the Germans have a ton of cavalry or something, but if they did, they could still block that line of supply. This is actually the historic setup. I'm going to go ahead and leave it out. Actually, I'm going to go ahead and switch it back. I take that back. We have now, hey, congratulations. We've figured out our lines of communication. They're doing fine. We know this guy's isolated. We don't need to worry about him anymore. Isolated is as bad as it gets. Next, we're going to throw the damn supply. This being the vassal module, of course, it has this handy show your standard range. And all right, so along this front line, there's also, I threw one here too, just for fun. So you can see all the units that are under that umbrella. There's more down here. This is actually Odessa's a supply source. So you can see there's like a tiny little window here of stuff that can't be supplied, but we don't really care. But wait a minute. These guys are not in supply. They're outside of that range. You don't have to trace supply, you throw supply. Think of it like a catapult, throwing giant wooden rabbits made to try to break into French castles to retrieve the Grail. That's exactly what this is doing, except that the French don't throw it back because we're not on the Western Front yet. So you can see that these 4 units are all going to be out of supply. That's not a big deal because they're not going to be attacking. Let me also note, this happens at the start of the very first turn. You check your opponent's supply. This goes much faster if you, at the end of your regular supply or regular movement phase, start sticking these little guys and figuring out who's in supply and who's not for your R-LoCs and N-LoCs. And then once you're done moving, you can make sure that all of your units have O-LoCs, the overlands, lines of communication. And then when it comes time for your opponent to do his stuff, he can just check for supply. I mean, he doesn't have to worry about the lines of communication or any of that stuff. You'll know that at the end of by the time you're done moving. So that's actually pretty handy. So what happens with these guys? The guys that are out of supply, their attack strength's halved. Yay! Who cares? Not a big deal. But they will stay out of supply for that entire week. When it comes around to their turn, they don't check their supply, they check the German supply. So it can go both ways. If these 2 units were like this, and thusly so, this guy would be out of supply, but he would be in communication, because the mech unit can go zip through those EZOCs. This guy would just be out of supply. And you can see there's just the one badge. Again, communication gets you your supply cities, gets you your HQs, make sure their supply via R-LoCs and LoCs. Then, or maybe they're just right in an ultimate supply source. That's a possibility too. That goes from here to then checking O-LoCs to make sure all your units are not isolated. Then, once that's done, you can take your supply and throw it where it needs to go. There are a few other subtleties about this, but that's really the gist of it. If you can do this, you understand supply and logistics and lines of communication in Thunder of the East. I've been Doug for Area 21 and for Wargaming Your Underwear, and we'll see you next time.